will be today's moderator. Rob?
Thank you, Raphael. Hello, everyone. I'll be serving as moderator, and the topics of today's sessions are pricing under distress and it's back, the inflation surge of the 2020s, and the return of the nonlinear Phillips curve. I want to express my special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schunle from Bernadette University and CEBRA, and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. As some background information for today's webinar, the webinar is 45 minutes in total with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each, and then 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer session at the end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during the presentation, so you do not have to wait until the end. So please enter your questions as we're going through the webinar, and we'll be happy to get to them. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar, again, after the presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel and is also recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Participation in the CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. So with all of that as background, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker will be Borağan Aruoba, professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland. He'll be talking under pricing under distress. And then our second speaker is Gauti Eggertsson, professor of economics, director of Orlando Bravo Center for Economics Research at Brown. He'll be talking about it's back, the inflation surge of the 2020s, and the return of the nonlinear Phillips curve. So with that, Borağan, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you to the organizers for having me here today. This is a joint paper with the authors listed here, and we have some policy makers among the co-authors, so these views are ours and not the institutions they work for. Okay, so price setting is one of the crucial things that firms do. And it's a central issue in macro. Obviously, inflation, today's topic, arises from firms setting prices. But another thing that's really important and linked to firms that price setting behavior of firms is the effectiveness of monetary policy. In most models that one may write down, the more prices adjust at the firm level, the less the real effect of monetary policy would be. And crucially, of course, price setting is a forward-looking activity, and that means whatever uncertainty the firms might have about the future would crucially influence the way they set their prices. Typically, we model uncertainty as the time variation in the dispersion of some fundamental distribution that the firm cares about. And we'd like to think about the effect of this type of a change in two distinct ways. One is the realization of this uncertainty. So the very fact that this distribution is now more dispersed. And separate from this is the anticipation of this increase in the time variation, increase in the dispersion rather, which may or may not be coupled with the actual realization of the increase. And Bloom's very influential 2009 paper distinguishes these as the volatility effect and the uncertainty effect. We'll stick with realization and anticipation. In a world where uncertainty is realized, like Barbara's QJE paper from 2014, the more so when the uncertainty is realized, this leads to, in a menu cost model that he wrote down, this leads to more price changes at the firm level and leads to monetary policy being less effective. In this paper, we're going to ask a question which is complementary to his work. we'll ask, is there a clean example of an episode where an anticipation effect was actually the dominant effect, the dominant channel, as opposed to the realization effect? And I'll show you shortly that the 2019 riots in Chile will in fact provide such an episode. And then we'll ask, if the anticipation effect is more dominant, how do firms change their pricing behavior? And what does this mean for the effectiveness of monetary policy? And our answer will be they apply a wait and see behavior to their pricing, and this in turn increases the effectiveness of monetary policy. Okay, so we're going to use a really rich and unique source of data from Chile to do an analysis. This is the business-to-business VAT invoice database that the Chilean central bank keeps, that they get from the tax authority. It contains the universe of business-to-business transactions, which every entry would include the description of the product, the buyer's name, the buyer's ID, seller's ID, price, and the quantity sold. We focus on supermarkets because they have well-defined input and output prices. And of course, it's also very traditionally used in a lot of research when studying firm pricing in the literature. Our unit of observation will be a supermarket location product pair, or triple. And we have transaction level data, which we aggregate up to days. And we apply some filters that we explain in the paper. At the end, we have over 27,000 products in our baseline data set with 67 supermarkets. Turning to the riots in Chile, in October of 2019, the subway fare in Santiago was increased by a small amount, by 5 cents, $5. This led to some protests, and in October 18th, this protest led to or turned into widespread unrest, which ensued for about a month. This was unexpected, large, but relatively short-lived. So here on the left, we show the Google trend for protestas in Chile, and you can see the sharp increase for this search term in Chile. The graph on the right shows police reports for desordines, which corresponds to destruction of property. And you also see a very large, sharp increase. Turning to
uncertainty,
this is uncertainty as proxied by standard deviation across forecasters, and you can see that normalizing the level at 100 just before the riots, there's an increase of 3 to 5-fold in the level of uncertainty that people in the economy were experiencing. So with those in mind, here's our baseline specification with this data. We'll have 4 different left-hand side variables. These will be either the occurrence of a price change, so it will be what we call a break, and we'll look at positive and negative price changes. And separately, we'll look at the size of the price change, condition on the price change. So those will be the 4 variables on that we consider on the left-hand side. We have a bunch of controls, some product level controls and some aggregate controls. There's going to be a rich set of fixed effects that capture all kinds of things that affect the way the firms change their prices. And the key variable to look at would be this D dummy variable, which is a dummy for the period October 18th through November 17th, the 1-month period following the start of the violent riots. So here's our baseline results, and the results to focus on here on this line. You can see that this dummy the coefficient for the dummy variable is highly significant in all cases. And for the positive breaks and the negative breaks, there is about a 0.3 percentage point decline in the frequency of price changes within a day. If you look here, the mean dependent variable is about 0.7 or 0.6, so 0.6% in a day. So this constitutes about a 40% decline in the frequency of price changes during this period. And no, let me make it clear that we do not include goods that cease to exist during this period. So this identification comes from goods that have been sold both during the riots and before the riots. So this is identified through these about 3,000 products that are in this category. If you look at the size of price changes, we see that on average the size of a price change was about 10 percentage points, and there's a increase of about 0.2 percentage points. Sorry, rather 2 percentage points during the riots, both positive and negative. So the frequency of price changes fall quite drastically by around 40% relative to prior to the riots, and conditional on a price change, the size of price changes increased by about 20%. One may be tempted to say, well, maybe the suppliers of the supermarkets changed their prices, and that's why the supermarkets started doing so. One of the unique features of our data set is that we're able to link the goods that the supermarkets sell to the suppliers that provide these goods to the supermarkets, because we have the universe of business-to-business transactions. So we repeat the same analysis in a matched sample, so where we match the goods of the firms, of the supermarkets, to their suppliers, and ask now if the suppliers have changed their pricing behavior. And you can see that the answer is clearly no. The suppliers during this 30-day period did not change the way they charge, the way they transact with the supermarkets. Next, we consider the intensity of riots. We have a variable that captures how intense the riots were based on various police records. And we interact the dummy variable with the intensity of the riots, trying to capture the idea that maybe in places where the riots were more visible, pricing behavior of the firms, the supermarkets, changed in a more significant way. And the conclusion that we have is that they did not. The interacted variable here is not significant, which suggests that this wasn't really about now, what's going on outside the window of the supermarkets, but it was something, perhaps something about what they expect that might happen in the future. So wrapping up the empirical side, we find that the riots decrease the frequency of price changes and increase the size of price changes. We did not find any change in the behavior of the suppliers, suggesting that this change is not coming from supply side forces from the viewpoint of the supermarkets. And the supermarkets didn't seem to be reacting to something contemporaneous. And all of this then leads us to turn to a structural model, a menu cost model, that's going to feature demand for the supermarket's product, and there's going to be an arrival of news about future dispersion of this demand. And we think that this is one way at least to think about what may have happened in Chile during these riots. So the model is going to be a fairly off-the-shelf workhorse menu cost model that Vavra has considered in his QJ paper. Here in this model, we have some intermediate producers that set their prices subject to a fixed adjustment cost or a menu cost. There's going to be some TFP process that's leptocurtic, so sometimes the TFP moves around and sometimes it doesn't. We're going to interpret TFP in the case of supermarkets as the supplier's cost, supplier's prices that the supermarket faces. We have two major departures from this standard model. One is going to be the introduction of idiosyncratic demand shocks. Of course, we're going to add news about this in a second, but let me just introduce the demand shock itself. And as it's well known, in a model with standard CES preferences, CES aggregation, we will not be able to have any pricing response to this demand shock. Therefore, we deviate from CES and introduce the Kimball aggregator, the so-called Kimball aggregator, which has elasticity of price not constant but changing with respect to some firm levels characteristics. So that's the model. One of the interesting things that we're able to do, given our data, is actually we're able to calibrate the model to some Chilean micro data facts. And I just focus on these here. So we are able to compute the markup of the goods that the supermarkets sell. Turns out it's about 34%. Our model matches that. We're able to also compute the pass-through of the supermarket's suppliers' prices to the supermarket's shelf prices. And that turns out to be about 29%. And that's the key reason, the fact that this is 29% and not 100% is the key reason we want to use the Kimball aggregator, which allows us to get less than perfect pass-through, whereas the CES aggregator would have given us 100% pass-through. We match the fraction of price changes that are positive. We match the size of price changes. This is unconditional, and that's 12% roughly. And the frequency of price change is about 30% at the monthly frequency. For those of you familiar with the US data, this is much higher than what we have in the US, about 2 to 3 times higher, but that's the data that we have in Chile. So the model is calibrated to these facts. And then we introduce the news shock as an unanticipated news shock, so a one-time shock that hits the economy that was not anticipated before. We think that the riots in Chile would fit this explanation quite well, in the sense that nobody would have expected them to happen, a few months prior to this event. So it's reasonable that it's a one-time event. And here, looking at the innovation to this demand term, we introduced this VT+1, which is going to tell the firm that their innovation tomorrow, the dispersion that they face, may increase D-fold, where D will be a number like 1, 2, 3, with a particular probability P, and it may not increase, and with 1 minus P probability, it might just stay at its current level. Repeating our exercise with monthly data, the top panel here shows you that at the monthly frequency, we have a decline of about 10% in the frequency of price changes and about 2% in the increase of price changes subject to actually a price change. And we show here various values for D and P, and just highlight one of the intermediate ones, 75% chance that your demand dispersion will triple, and 25% probability it will not happen. So we're able to get to about 30% of the effect that we see in the data. And all of these are, of course, untargeted moments, which we consider to be reasonable. Finally, turning to a monetary policy shock, here we consider a one-time unanticipated increase in nominal expenditures. So here we have, first, I guess, let's just focus here. If there's no news at all, and the monetary policy shock arrives in period 1, then 44% of this shock is transmitted to the real economy with a cumulated impulse response of 0.10, so that accumulates the response of the economy, the real side, throughout the life of this shock. But if we introduce this news in period 1, when the shock is happening, the monetary policy shock is happening, then in period 2, perhaps some increase in demand may happen. That increases the impact response of monetary policy from 44 to 52%, which constitutes an 18% increase in the effectiveness of monetary policy in this case. Now, in period 2, if the shock actually does happen, you can see that there's no more any effect of monetary policy, because as the shock has been realized, all the firms scramble to change their price to adapt to this new large shocks that they face, and then they incorporate whatever the effect of the remaining monetary policy was in their price changes, wiping off the remaining real effects of the shock. Whereas if the news actually is not realized in period 2, you can see that there is still some significant response of the monetary policy shock in period 2. Finally, if the news arrives in period 1 about shock in period 2, but the monetary policy also happens to be implemented in period 2, you can see that the difference is quite stark. So if the shock is realized, then the monetary policy is not effective at all. There's very little effect, and that's the VABRA result. But if the news actually is not realized in period 2, and monetary policy also hits in period 2, there's a quite significant response still left on the real side. So we conclude from this, and this is my last slide, when we consider the situation that the Chilean firms were under distress. They were facing a situation where they received the news about the future, and things can become really volatile in the future. And the conclusion here is that the timing of the policy is everything. If monetary policy happens to be implemented at the time where the news arrives, then it's going to be quite effective. But if the monetary policy arrives later, when the shock is actually realized, as Baber has shown, monetary policy will not be effective or as effective. So let me conclude here. Happy to answer questions, I guess, at the end.
Thanks, Borağan. So again, let me remind our participants and audience members that if you have questions, to go ahead and submit them in the Q&A section. So with that, thank you, Borağan, and I will now turn to our second speaker. Gauti, the floor is yours. Oh, Gauti, I think you're on. You might be on mute still.
Okay. You can hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And today what I'm going to be talking about is, let me just share my screen so you'll, to leave you in no doubt. So what I'm going to talk about today is this recent paper that I wrote with Pier Paolo that has the name It's Back, the Surge of Inflation in the 2000s and the Return of the Nonlinear Phillips Curve. So let me just first set the stage and, well, and check the time, 15 minutes. I'm going to be sticking strictly to my allocated time. So this paper, of course, is about this surge in inflation that to me came as a total surprise. And this picture that you're familiar with shows you PCE core and CPI. And I guess I just wanted to remind you of how concentrated and quick this surge was. It really, inflation went above target after February 21. That was right basically after Biden passed the Stimulus Act. And it really didn't start showing any signs of going down until in March 22, when the Fed lifted rates from 0 and started the interest rate, hikes that we just recently saw paused. But the rapid increase in inflation was very surprising to me, as I think it was for many others. So surprising, in fact, that I felt or Pier Paolo and I felt the need to revisit sort of our standard benchmark model, which is the new Keynesian model in our case. Others may have other benchmarks in mind, but that was what informed my projections at the time that turned out to be wrong. So what's the summary of what we do? Well, we're going to explain why myself and Pier Paolo and a host of other economists were caught by a surprise by returning to something that is closer to the original Phillips curve. That's why the title says it's back, highly nonlinear Phillips curve. And it's going to be, the nonlinearity is going to be triggered by what we call labor shortage, namely that the number of vacancies the firm posts that remain unfilled relative to unemployment in each period. Once that, you can think of that as sort of unemployed jobs of firms relative to workers looking for jobs. Once that reaches a critical level, these nonlinearities are going to kick in. So we're first going to provide evidence for this. So we're basically going to replace the traditional measure of output slack or tightness in Phillips curve with this here new variable, this V over U. the firm vacancy over the number of jobs the firms are looking to fill divided by the number of workers looking for jobs. First, I'm going to provide some evidence for this nonlinear relationship, and then sketch out a theory. The explanation for this search is actually not only that we saw a search in V over U over a critical level, that we are going to be finding that a relatively reasonable level is one that actually has a long history in the labor literature, namely 1. So there are more firms looking for workers than the workers looking for job. So that's going to be a critical value that we find does a reasonable job approximate the data. So the explanation for the inflation search is going to be what we call labor shorter. So this is going to be greater than 1. And this is going to have an effect on inflation beyond just wage pressures. So that's number 2, but number 1. But number 2 is a slightly, it's an interaction term. So it turns out that if you accept this notion of a nonlinear Phillips curve, it's sort of going to supercharge the supply shocks. They're going to have much bigger effect. So we can have a model in which there's going to be intermediate input, think oil. So when the labor market is very tight and you have an increase in the price of any input or intermediate input, well, you can't substitute away from them into labor. So that's going to mean that the supply shock have a bigger impact. So I'm going to maybe have time to talk about some policy implications. So I guess at the time we released a paper that was a prediction. Now it's starting to look more like a prediction that is at least looking pretty good at this time, that a soft landing can be achieved. That's a key prediction of the model. Can doesn't mean that it necessarily must. That depends on policy. And I'm actually a little concerned that the Fed has pause this rate hikes, even if the labor market is still pretty hot. So as measured by V over U. So I would have waited until I was more confident there. So let me just remind you first, this was something I was figuring out in the process of making this. So if you look at the original Phillips curve, one of the things you notice is actually and that's his actually main point. It's like the topic of the first paragraph of his paper, is that there is not just a relationship between unemployment and the rate of change of wages, but that it's highly nonlinear, okay? And the reason he gave for this is pretty straightforward. When the demand for labor is high and there are very few unemployed, we should expect employers to bid up wage rates quite rapidly. However, even if unemployment is very high, workers are going to be reluctant to offer their services at less than prevailing wage rates. Okay, so the firms are not going to be able to undercut the prevailing wage rate, but the firms will have every incentive when the unemployment is high to. So we're going to model this as basically this is going to be like a flex wage regime, and here there's going to be a wage norm. But we'll get to that. We'll get to the model. So if you just plot his estimate against, this was sort of pre-Phillips, this was the crude notion of a Phillips curve, or not really the supply side that the old style Keynesians assume. Prices were just fixed until you hit a wall. Well, you can increase output with increasing demand, but there's a limited amount of people you can hire. So once you've hired everybody that is available for work, you just hit a wall, and then they start showing up in prices. And the thing is, this is the estimated Phillips curve, just plotted in 1 minus U from Phillips. And you can see that it really has this sort of inverse or backward L shape, which is exactly going to be the kind of Phillips curve that we're going to derive. So then the thing is, it's sort of weird, but it seems like this nonlinearity sort of, well, it wasn't Phillips' original paper, but it sort of got lost in transit when it came to America. So because when Phillips comes to America and Zola and Samuelson, well, it's kind of not a whole lot of nonlinearity there. And in fact, in most of our analyses, we have a linear Phillips curve. And even if we have, even if we cite Phillips for our construction, And of course, what happened after Solo's Emerson, people didn't start talking about nonlinearity, but the fact that it ignored expectations, and we all know what happened. It looked very good. Their Phillips curve from in the 60s, the 10 years after they wrote their paper, it looked good. Then in the 70s, expectations started moving all over the place, and you see the collapse in the Phillips curve, right? So the story most of us told ourselves about this was that the old Keynesians had this relationship. And then, the collapse of the Phillips curve happened because expectations became unanchored, and partially because of some supply shocks. But the bottom line, and the reason why I think a lot of us underestimated the rise in inflation, was that all prevailing estimate at the time, in February 2021, suggested that, if unemployment if unemployment would go down by a little bit, that should 1% decline in unemployment should just lead to a 1/3 increase in inflation. So, unemployment was still pretty high in 2021. So we thought, or I thought that, we may have a bit of a boom, but it should have very limited effect on. So kappa, in other words, was estimated to be very, very low. And this is from an estimate from Hassel, Hirano, Steinson, and Nakamura, QJE 22. And they were using cross-sectional data. And I just want to note to you the dates that we're looking at, 78 to 2018. Our model is going to be consistent with their estimate. It's just going to be the case that they don't capture periods in which the labor market is very hot and these nonlinearities kick in. So, the 70s, sort of to summarize, the expectations did it, maybe coupled with some supply shocks that played a role in making expectation unanchored. So what I want to then point out to you is, so what is it that 5 inflation have in common if you just ignore the 70s? Well, an interesting aspect that they have in common is if you take a look at, remember, my measure of tightness, V over U, so it's the number of jobs the firms are trying to fill divided by the number of workers looking for job. So if that number is greater than 1, well, there are more firms looking to fill job than the workers looking to get a job. So that measure has been above 1, really just, so the question here, what do 5 inflation have in common? Well, that's what they have in common. You have here, after in the inflation surge, this V over U is above 1. During the Vietnam War, we see it also creep above 1. It's not during the 70s. I think the expectation did that. And then we have the Korean War. We have World War II, and this is actually the greater level of tightness we have seen since World War II. And then World War I. And, I'm not going to talk about these here 2 little blips because I don't know enough about 23 and 26 to be able to form an informed view on it. So the bottom line is, if you just look at US economic history, when you have had 5 inflation surges, leaving the 70s aside, they all have this thing in common, that tightness is moving above 1. So the key idea then is going to be is to replace in our Phillips curve X, which may be unemployment output gap, with instead this measure, vacancies over unemployment. So that's going to be the measure of economic activity. And then there's going to be a nonlinearity that kicks in here when theta is equal to 1. So, and so the hypothesis then is that we have been in this region through the entire estimation sample we usually use, like 78 to 2018. But we are seeing now the consequences of moving outside of it. Okay, so why would we want to think about V over U? Well, one reason for it is that U, in fact, and that was why the Fed wasn't tightening between March 21 to 22. If you just looked at U, it didn't look too bad. I mean, you were just going back to where you were prior to the pandemic. It's only when you really start taking, and labor force participation also had not quite reached pre-pandemic levels. Well, there's the reason for that, which was that a lot of people, of course, didn't want to work during this time period. And this is a period then that V over U captures very well the tightness in the labor market, not only counting the number of people looking for jobs, but also the number of jobs the firms are trying to fill. It makes sense that both of these things should matter for tightness. And if you look at how typically unemployment relative to V/U, they have been really moving together pretty well. This just goes back to 2009. It's really this period that is pretty unusual, which makes this, it's very important to keep this in mind, the V/U as a superior measure of tightness than unemployment alone, simply because the natural rate of unemployment presumably here was very high due to various reasons. So let me just give you the empirical result. Well, this is the kind of empirics I like. A scatter plot, I can understand it. It's just data, right? Except I took log of V/U, and I've just split it into 4 time periods. This here is the 60 to 69, when you had the run up to the Vietnam War, and there was the tax cut Lyndon Johnson implemented. And you can see here that that was a period in which V/U in logs went above 1, which log of 1,0, right? And you see this looks like a pretty nonlinear Phillips curve. And similarly here, 2008, 2023, you similarly see these nonlinearities kick in. If you take a look at 70 to 87, or 87 to 2008, you see a very flat Phillips curve. Okay, so that's just the data. We can formalize it in a regression. And here I'm just going to do the most basic thing. I'm just going to put a dummy when this thing here is above 1. I mean, we experimented with different cutoffs, but one has this intuitive feel that more firms are looking for workers than workers looking for jobs, that has a history dating back to Beveridge as a criteria. So we just stuck with that. And I'm just going to put a dummy then on when it's above 1, and I'm going to put a dummy on the supply shock as well. And I just want to highlight 2 points, that it is the estimate of this dummy is statistically significant, highly statistically significant, and also importantly, the dummy on the supply shock is also highly statistically significant, while the effect of the supply shock seems to barely register anything once without the dummy. Okay, and then the thing, and that's important because people have been talking a lot about supply shock as the driver of this inflation. I think that is correct, but it's sort of hard to, if you look at the measures we had of supply shock prior to the inflation surge, well, these supply shock looks no different from what we have seen in the past year, and much smaller than what we saw in the 70s. So this is like the standard measure of supply shock: PPU, CPI headline inflation shock, PC headline import price shock, and we just took a principal component. But any measure, ex post, of course, people have come up with all sorts of measures but if you just look at the measure we used before this, then I think it's hard, except if you interact it with something else, which is what we are doing. So this is just the regression result in terms of decomposition of what the driving forces are. Now, of course, it's just an equilibrium relationship in our model, but I think it's still somewhat informative. It's decomposition, and you can see here these areas here, which are the thing that have the strikes through. Those are the labor tightness when V is over U is greater than 1, and then the cost push-up are the red. Those are the interactions. So the cost push is having an effect only because of the interaction. It's actually, the estimate is slightly negative. I mean, it's just not statistically significant for the cost push shock alone. So the picture, and so labor market tightness plays a role here, but the nonlinearity, which is this part, is the one that is playing the biggest role. So I guess I'm out of time, or do I have 2 minutes? How much time do I have left?
I'll give you 1 minute, Gauti. How's that?
1 minute. Okay. So this just shows you MSA level data that shows similar nonlinear pattern. This is from a student, Julia Giddy, that is on the market for this year, and this is showing unemployment and log. Okay, so the model is just an Keynesian model with intermediate input, search and matching, and then we're going to capture Phillips' idea with wages being set either flexibly or when the labor market is not tight, it's going to be sort of a norm. Obtain a piecewise, and this is going to be just the summary of the result. We're going to get a piecewise linear log linear curve here. And the point is that this here coefficient, both on the cost push shock and the tightness, is going to be a lot higher on this segment when theta is above 1. So this could explain the 70s, and it also could explain the current run-up. And the point here is just that going from C to D predicts a soft landing because you're at the steep part. While if you would take the flat part, it would be incredibly costly to bring down inflation if you took like the kappa and Nakamura and Steinchen, or there, I guess, because inflation are anchored, yeah, it would be very costly. Here, this is saying, no, it's not going to be that costly. So that's it. Implication for policy, easy up, easy down, provided the Fed doesn't over tighten. My key prediction is a soft landing. That may not be a prediction anymore. Maybe it's actually what we're seeing. And of course, it doesn't suggest the Fed shouldn't tighten. No, they need to tighten. And in fact, I'm worried they didn't tighten enough because the labor market is still with V over U above 1. So let me then end with that. I think I'm out of time. New framework. So we have a modeling framework that, you know, gives this equation and replaces output gap with this tightness, but it has this piecewise linear, and it comes from the weight setting side, like suggested by Phillips. We have suggestive evidence and some policy applications. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gauti. We do have time for a couple of questions, so I'm going to start by asking Borağan a question that comes from Oleski Christoph. So Borağan, Oleski's question is, in the model, does it matter if firms perceive the uncertainty to be transient? If they believe the riots will not last, the anticipation effect will be weaker, they'd prefer to wait and see.
Yes, thanks for the question. In the model, indeed, the shock will, if it arrives, it's going to, the innovation will be high for one period, but of course the demand that they face is a persistent process. So even if it goes up once, the innovation, the effect of that persistent process will take some time to fully die out. So it's not an IID process where if it happens and it just goes away. In that sense, you know, the anticipation effect, I think, would and we are increasing in our baseline the dispersion by a magnitude of 3, a factor of 3, and that's actually going to be a major significant increase for this process.
Okay, thanks. So as moderator, I'm going to ask the next question. I'm going to ask Gauti about this. And so Gauti, here's my question. If you look at the US, that inflation surge principally started in the goods sector. The service sector, if you break down inflation into sort of goods and services, that initial surge in inflation took place in the goods sector. So I guess my question would be, have you thought about looking across the two sectors? Because according to your story, the V over U should have been much more impactful initially in the inflation surge because most of the inflation was coming, I think, from the goods sector. And then eventually it's been the services sector that sort of has now been responsible. So I guess the question is, can you take the aggregate data that you're looking at and now think about it, looking at goods versus services to see if the implications are holding up across those two sectors?
So, yeah, I mean, this is something that we have started to look at, but don't have any conclusive answers for as of yet. I do think it is one reason for why, you know, you needed, why you had V over U going up this much, because you had some sectoral reallocation being needed. You know, you had the job openings were largely in, or under your hypothesis, if the job openings were largely in the goods sector, but a lot of the unemployed people were in the service sector, that could be one reason for why you were seeing V over U rising and giving a different signal than just looking at unemployment alone. So a more detailed model that would have a two-sector model is something we have thought about and are working on. It's a little tricky, though, to model to be thinking about V over U sector by sector, because then you start thinking about what does it mean to be unemployed in a sector. I mean, people move across sectors. So, but no, I think that's a very natural question and one that we've been thinking about because it is a key aspect of the recovery, how uneven it was, that the recovery and demand for goods was much stronger than the recovery and demand for services. So it's just an open question that we haven't addressed yet, but I think it's a good one and important.
Yeah, as I said, I think it would be interesting simply because it was a very different. It wasn't an old. The surge in inflation was not sort of balanced across those sectors. There was
right.
a sort of different
I think
dimension. Okay,
Right.
we have time for two more questions. I hope, Raphael, if that's okay. I'll have one for Borağan and then one for Gauti, and then we'll call it. So Borağan, a follow-up from Oleski is the following. In addition to higher uncertainty, the riots could raise the costs of changing prices directly. Example given, maybe stores had less staff for changing prices. Is this effect important in the data or the model?
Yes, that's something we have thought about as well, and it comes up very frequently. So in the model that we wrote down, if you simply changed the cost of changing prices, you would get the same qualitative response in the way the firms change their prices. So in that sense, it's pretty much equivalent. In the data, I think one. And also in the model, remember that we explain about 30–40% of what's going on in terms of the change in the frequency of price changes and the size of the price changes. So certainly there's room for other explanations, and this idea that the supermarkets had to move resources away from pricing and maybe put people at the door so things don't get destroyed and so on. So that's certainly a very reasonable explanation. However, empirically, when we looked at, remember, the interaction term with the intensity of the riots and the duration, the dummy variable for the riots, we did not find any significant effect on that interaction term, which suggests that whether or not there were riots right at your door did not really make a difference in your pricing behavior. So we would have expected for this to be very prevalent. Supermarkets that have riots right at their door would behave in a way that's different than those that don't, and we don't see this. But again, in terms of modeling, the two would certainly yield the same result.
Okay, thanks, Borağan. And this is the last question. This is for Gauti. This is from Lorenzo Eldelco. Do you think the degree of competition in the labor market matters for the slope of the Phillips curve, given that there's a lot of evidence in labor that firms have monopsony power? Could this dampen the wage responses to supply shocks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly an important element in determining the slope, both on both sides of the Phillips curve. I guess the point here is just that there is, I mean, the evidence seemed to suggest some sort of non-linearity happening at some point. In other words, that there are some wage norm that move slowly down when they're slack, but it seems to go easier when it goes up. So we haven't tried to incorporate. I mean, we model this in a very parsimonious way, so we don't go into the details of trying to model the bargaining process between workers and firms, except just to take it as given that there are these slow-moving norms and regular times, and then wages appear as flexible when the labor market is tight enough.
Okay.
Just a
Thanks.
little addition to your comment. That we saw the inflation showing up more in the goods market. In some respect, in the empirical analysis, some of this is captured by our measure of the cost push shock, because that's like the difference between high CPI inflation and core. So there was a big increase in some of the prices outside of core, and that's going to feed into as a cost push shock. But
Right, and some of our measures of underlying inflation, like the median and trim mean, actually show that it was that these were taking outside of the of core. So, but we can talk about this later. So, with that, I want to thank both Borağan and Gauti for their participation today. Thanks for the interesting presentations. And then, Raphael, that's okay. As a reminder, I'll talk about the next, if I believe it, the next scheduled presentation is for November 2nd with Yuri Gorodchenko from the University of California, Berkeley, along with Alexander Dietrich from the Danish National Bank. The moderator will be Hugh Montag. And so, Raphael, I'll turn over to you in case you have any closing remarks.
Thank you, everybody, so much. We had more questions than we could answer, so that's always a great sign. Thank you for the presentations and for the moderation, and hopefully see you next time. Thank you. Have a good day.